You are watching the press preview from Buckingham Palace. A first look at what's on the front pages as they arrive. So let's see what's on some of those front pages for you now. The Telegraph's headline, Devotion to Duty. The paper leads with the thousands queuing to honour the Queen as King Charles and his siblings stand vigil. The Sun leads with the same. Their headline, King and Country say farewell. Vigil for Mama leads the Daily Mail, picturing the King and his siblings standing vigil. The same image is on the front of the Express. Their headline, We're here with you always, ma'am. The Times also reports on the vigil held by the Queen's children in what they call an emotional end to a week of national mourning. The Star focuses on the long queue for people to pay their respects to the Queen and the second queue that was formed. The Guardian leads with comments from the fiancé of murdered journalist Jamal Khashoggi, condemning plans by the Crown Prince of Saudi Arabia to visit London to pay respects to the Queen. The Eye turns its attention to the cost of living. Their headline, Mortgage hike for millions as the pound falls. The FT also leads with the pound falling to its lowest level since 1985 against the dollar. And a reminder that by scanning the QR code you'll see on screen during the programme, you can check out the front pages of tomorrow's newspapers while you watch us. And we are joined tonight by Chief Executive of ConservativeHome, Mark Wallace, and Senior Associate Editor at the New Statesman, Rachel Cunliffe. Welcome to you both. Let us start with the Telegraph and their front page, the headline there, Devotion to Duty. Rachel.
Well, very powerful image there of the new king and his siblings standing vigil for their late mother. And you can see the thousands coming in to pay their respects. So while this moment of very personal, sort of intimate moment of grief occurring, at the same time, you've got the public sort of response to it, which kind of sums up what we've had this week, really. We've had the official events, we've had the new king going around to the four nations in a series of very sort of stylised, formal addresses. And you've had the public reaction, first in Edinburgh and now in London, making it really clear that this is an event that almost the whole country feels part of. Many of them, thousands of them, prepared to wait for hours, up to 24 hours, to really be part of it.
Mark, you certainly got that sense of the family themselves handing over the Queen to the public when she was taken to Westminster Hall.
Yes, and I think particularly looking at this scene with the King and his siblings, they're joining the Guard of Honour for their mother as she lies in state. In this place of such deep history, this is in a building that was built by the son of William the Conqueror. This is on the spot where Charles I was tried and sentenced to death. This is a room where Henry VIII played tennis. And you have this great sense of continuity. When people talk, we talk abstractly about a 1,000-year monarchy. This is visibly the transition in that. It's a really remarkable scene.
But you do, though, have the personal moment. It seemed like a personal moment with her children standing guard, holding the vigil, but then streams of people flowing past. Hardly a private moment, but it did still seem to be.
I think the amount of pressure on all of them, particularly on King Charles, to have that balance. Obviously, they are grieving a mother, the grandchildren are all holding vigil tonight, grieving a grandparent. We've had some very moving tributes from different members of the royal family, but still having those ceremonial roles and pretty much, with a couple of exceptions, not faltering in that whole week that we've seen. It's sort of a reminder that they are dealing with a personal bereavement at that time. And also, I think there's something, sort of, Mark was talking about the history of the room, the history of the traditions. There's this quite interesting juxtaposition because these are traditions that are hundreds of years old and have applied to various monarchs throughout Britain's history, but we haven't seen them for 70 years. So for the vast majority of the country, this is the first time we're experiencing them. It's the first time a lot of them have been televised. So bringing modern technology and bringing the cameras into quite intimate moments and into that moment of history You were there today, weren't you?
I was very fortunate last night, actually, to get to spend half an hour observing people paying their respect in Westminster Hall. And it was fascinating, particularly for two reasons. Firstly, covering politics. You see Parliament and the parliamentary estate in every kind of mood. You see it, dolled up and locked down, empty, busy, angry, bound up in politics or tourism. I thought I'd seen it in every mood that it had, and actually this is a completely, for obvious reasons, unique kind of mode. The silence sounds obvious. It's very hard to describe the mood in Westminster Hall, but actually that really personal, every single person who came through, watching over the course of half an hour, you see hundreds and hundreds of people. Everybody had their own way of commemorating that moment, of paying their own personal respects. You saw people from the armed forces or the emergency services, people bringing very, very new babies or very, very elderly, each having their own personal moment there. And that is part of, the fact is this is a personal moment as well as a state moment for the royal family, as you say. And actually it's part of that relationship I think they have with the wider public, that they too have that individual moment.
And interesting that you say that each person moving along had their own particular private moment. There is no rule book, is there? And there is no particular etiquette that they will have been told that they should carry out, and everybody treating the moment individually.
Yes, I think the one thing that has been very, very clear is no phones allowed. And you can see in the footage, I'm sure you saw it sort of last night, the difference that makes, having a moment that is entirely about being in the moment and personal reflection, not people trying to get photos. Why you try and get photos anyway when some of the country's best photographers are there getting their own professional photos is another matter. But it's not about the technology, it's not about people's taking a photograph to show off or to have that. It's about personal reflection and making a memory and marking that moment in people's own way.
And the Sun, highlighting what we've been saying, their headline, King and Country say farewell, the personal grief and loss of the royal family, but also loss for the country.
Absolutely, and I think quite a lot of people have been surprised the degree to which they've been personally deeply touched and moved by what's happened in a variety of these different events over the course of the last week of official mourning. The number of times you anecdotally speak to people and they say, well, we knew that this day would come eventually, but actually even then the way it struck people, the depth of feeling, I think has taken quite a lot of people, regardless even of their political views on the Constitution and so on, their personal connection with the Queen has really taken some people aback.
Yeah, and a lot of people have related it to their own lives. They might have suffered a bereavement themselves, or it's the Queen reminded them of their grandmother or their mother. So it's not only the grief for the loss of the Queen, it's also they've been relating it to their personal circumstances as well.
Yes, and I think the 2 years of COVID and lockdown probably has had an impact as well. All those missed events, having to do funerals via Zoom. I think, while that was obviously very necessary, that may have sort of cemented in people's minds the importance of being there in person and that sort of collective experience. And I think there was that feature that I think The Guardian did a few years ago that was Operation London Bridge, that was sort of laying out what would happen, all the plans for when the Queen did eventually pass away. And one of the lines in that was, people who don't think they're going to cry will cry. And that was sort of predicted. And I think that's kind of inevitable when, obviously, the vast majority of us didn't know her, never met her. But when something that has been a sort of fundamental backdrop to your life changes, even if you know it's inevitable, even if you know it's going to happen, it's still a shock. And the sort of national reaction to that is I think, partly what's behind the 24-hour, several-mile-long queue that we're seeing in London.
It's often one of the things I think that's underappreciated, particularly by observers from countries that don't have a monarchy. It's underappreciated from outside. It's quite hard to explain the degree to which, of course, the royal family in all sorts of ways aren't like us, but in the most fundamental ways they are. They are a family. They are, and the nation does routinely identify, an awful lot of people around the country identify with those same familial experiences: marriage, birth, death, mourning, and that's exactly why people identify. It's not it's not only the Queen who people identified as their grandmother. You read back in history, you find an awful lot of people over centuries have felt this way in identifying the kind of rhythms of life that you see on a national stage beneath the pomp and circumstance. This is a family which sits at the heart of the nation.
Are you nonetheless surprised by the outpouring of grief and the lengths that people are prepared to go to actually pay their final respects, queuing for hours and hours and hours on end?
Well, I was at first, and I probably shouldn't have been. You predicted that the queue would become a story sort of in and of itself, and obviously it has done. And I was sort of a bit bemused by it, but I went down there yesterday and I sort of walked along about a mile of it, and I talked to people who were in it, and sort of two things struck me. One was that the mood was not cheerful, but sort of not stressed, not anxious. This wasn't a queue. Normally people get a bit stressed when they're queuing. They get a bit sort of, I don't know, antsy about it. Everyone in that queue was very content to be in the queue. There was a steward who said 3 to 4 hours to go now, and everyone went, good, OK, which is sort of an interesting mood. And what struck...
I suppose because expectations had been set, so they knew that it wasn't going to be a quick queue.
But I think it was more than that, because you can leave the queue with a wristband and come back. And theoretically, I imagine you could leave for quite some time and come back, but people aren't. And I think actually the act of standing in the queue, there was somebody who said, you know, it's a personal act of service in recognition of the acts of service that the Queen performed over her life. And so actually spending that time in the queue is in itself something that people feel quite proud to be doing, regardless of what happens at the end of it.
I suppose, Mark, it's a little bit like wearing a hair shirt, isn't it? Going through that experience, and part of your discomfort shows your commitment to the Queen.
Well, as a lot of people have noted, there's quite deep resonance of pilgrimage in some parts of this, that kind of, whether you're religious or not, that kind of heritage of going on a journey and going on a journey with other people in order to commemorate. I think that idea of that feeling that commemoration is a collective thing. And I think that you're absolutely right that particularly during the pandemic periods when people were compelled to go through a traumatic experience not together was in many ways made it all the harder. And these opportunities, whether it's in the queue, whether it's people at major sporting events singing the national anthem together, whether it's a shared minute of silence, that collective experience. My wife and I brought our children just over there to the gates of Buckingham Palace last Saturday. We intended to come by for an hour, lay flowers and see what was there. We ended up staying for 8.5 hours with a bunch of other people who are complete strangers around you. You share the experience together and you do remember it. Will almost certainly never cross paths again, but actually that memory is part of that experience. Just as the crowd who were on the Mall for the Platinum Jubilee, exactly the same thing. It's something that's experienced together as a communal act of mourning, has its own kind of value and power and benefit to people.
The Star, Rachel, meanwhile, is poking a little bit of fun at the queues with their headline because there was a sub-queue. QE2 is their pun this evening.
Well, I kind of think that you do need moments of levity as well, right? And if you think about it sort of in an abstract, the queue is quite a strange thing. There have been people who, one of my colleagues at the New Statesman has written a sort of science fiction story about the queue. You've had people pointing out that you might have new relationships, romances flourishing in the queue. Maybe Richard Curtis will one day make a film about the queue, like Love Actually, this sort of strangers coming together and meeting. And I think it's strange, right? It's a living monument in and of itself. But fundamentally, I think it's people realising that this is a key moment of history and wanting to be part of it. And if that means having to queue for the queue, I think you've got a Sky reporter who's there at the intersection of the two queues, where the queue for the queue becomes the queue itself. That's just part of the story. It's part of the legend, and I imagine that the queue will be in the history books when historians come to reflect on this quite strange week in British history.
Let's face it, Mark, queuing is part of the culture, isn't it?
Absolutely. If you're going to choose one final sport in the world which we're still dominant at, it's queuing. And as soon as they announced that the queue was closed, obviously there was going to be a queue to join the queue. I mean, this is Britain, after all. And I like the fact that this obviously reflects people's dedication to wanting to pay their respects. But let's be honest, everyone who's in the queue to join the queue is having a bit of a chortle together about the fact they've managed to to do it twice.
But I mean, you're right about people forming relationships during the course of the day. Our reporters have been in the queue with various people who'd never met before and have actually formed such strong bonds that they've decided that they're going to complete the queue together, and they'll be swapping numbers and forming new relationships and friendships.
With David Beckham.
I was going to say, for some lucky people,
I don't know if he swapped his numbers with anyone.
but he was there for over 10 hours, I think.
Yeah, I think it was, about 13 hours. And curiously, all by himself, it seemed, throughout.
Well, I think he had various people coming to take pictures with him at various points. But yeah, it's a levelling experience, isn't it?
And he was quite emotional when he actually got into Westminster Hall, and I think we caught on camera shed a tear.
Well, I think that's interesting as well. So the people who I know who've completed the queue experience, as it were, have all said that the experience of being in the queue, there's a lot of camaraderie, there's a lot of sort of cheerfulness and getting to know people, and then suddenly you are in Westminster Hall and the mood changes completely. It's very silent, it's very moving. Obviously, as I said, no phones, sort of no talking, and you get that reflection. And then when they come out of it again, there's quite a sort of strong emotional response to that, and you can sort of see that with David Beckham, but also with a lot of the people in that footage.
Yeah, and interestingly, David Beckham was offered a shortcut, a short route by the authorities there, the people looking after the queue, and he refused.
And he's an awful lot of people have kind of noted that and praised his kind of decision to do that as part of that levelling experience, just as you say. And that moment, as you say, I think that moment when people step into the hall is definitely noticeable when you watch people kind of filing through Westminster Hall. When they arrive, kind of step into the building, that kind of sombre mode. I think people struggle. You can see people struggling to work out exactly how they feel about it, and you can, from vicars to punks yesterday, you saw people kind of, got a mote of dust in their eye, and the one thing they all had in common is that everybody gets to the exit and stops for a second and looks back to kind of take the scene in one last time.
Let's move on to what the King's been doing today, and he's been in Wales. The Times, pages 4 and 5, have got a spread on this, and he spoke of his love for Wales. I mean, he was a Prince of Wales for an awfully long time.
He spoke of his love for Wales in Welsh, which the Times is reporting is...
He spoke in Welsh first, didn't he?
Yes, the longest speech given by a monarch in Welsh since that of Queen Elizabeth I, I think. And obviously he has been... One of the consequences of the Queen having such a long reign is he has had a very long tenure as Prince of Wales, and it's clear that that's somewhere that he has a lot of affection and devotion for. And the act as well of passing the mantle of Prince of Wales onto his son is something that he was also quite emotional about.
And it's remarkable to think to see Elizabeth I, as we were saying before. Obviously, her father was Welsh, and she was raised effectively in a kind of Anglo-Welsh family. But this has been a punishing tour as well, of kind of dedication and duty for the new king. He's as we say, he's grieving. He's lost his beloved mother. He's become the monarch. And he's has a 10-day kind of process of visiting each of the home nations. They're spending an awful lot of time, I think, to their credit, meeting people who've come to see them, who've come to pay their respects, taking that time to exchange words with the public.
It hasn't seemed rushed at all, has it? And they've been over schedule because they've taken that time to speak to people.
And he must be exhausted by now. And that in that dichotomy, as you were saying earlier, of the kind of the official nature of these responsibilities, but in a period of personal loss, must be unimaginably difficult.
Let's just one thing in Wales. I don't know if you're aware of the man in the crowd who had said that taxpayers are going to have to pay for this visit. We can't afford it with the cost of living crisis. Did you see that?
I saw that there was a protester. I saw some reports of there being a kind of sole.
What did you make of that?
I think that it's valid questions to be asked at the moment, especially on the backdrop of the cost of living crisis, and it is something that I think we'll have a national conversation about subsequently, is how protesters have been dealt with over the last sort of week, or just not even protesters, just people who have a different view of the monarchy and how they get the time and space to express that within the context of this sort of national mourning period. But the cost of living crisis was something that the King, which is still a very strange thing to be saying, but the King addressed with Mark Drakeford. And I think because he has obviously been waiting for this moment for a very long time, he does have an understanding of how things look, the state of the country, how difficult life is going to be for an awful lot of people, and an awareness that in a constitutional monarchy, you kind of have to, that the messaging is important and the optics are important, and I think he does have an awareness of that, hence those statements.
Should we take a look at that clip for those that might have missed it?
Charles, while we struggle to heat our homes, we have to pay for your parade.
Thank you for coming.
The taxpayer pays 100 million for you, and what for? Me and Brennan, not my king.
Yes, Mark, he clearly heard what was said, didn't he?
Yes, but that's part of the nature, one of the many good things about the nation in which we live, that something like that can actually happen. There's quite a lot of countries in the world where even your political leaders, elected or otherwise, wouldn't hear something like that, never mind a monarchical head of state. Exactly as Rachel says, frankly, there have been moments in recent days, I'm a monarchist, but as I think is probably evident from the conversation we've had this evening, but there have been times in recent days where some of the decision-making by Police Scotland or the Metropolitan Police, frankly, has been excessive and heavy-handed, with people who've protested, or in some cases not even protested, been kind of warned off on suspicion of maybe expressing an opinion. I don't think anybody really wants that to be the case. I very much doubt that the royals particularly want that to be kind of forbidden or clamped down. It's quite counterproductive. So I think it's healthy. People have the right to express opinions like that. I think, were I that gentleman, I'd probably question whether I'm doing my cause a huge favour by choosing that particular moment with a kind of grieving monarch. But that's your right. It's in the nature of the country in which we live.
Rachel, you've got about 30 seconds, a little less actually. Just tell us about the mortgage hike for millions that's about to hit.
The MPC obviously have pushed back their scheduled meeting a week out of sort of respect for the Queen, but that doesn't mean that interest rates aren't going up. They are. That is to combat inflation, but that is unfortunately going to be yet another thing pushing up the cost of living for millions across the country.